If you've seen one too many TikToks about autism and now you suspect that that might be the correct diagnosis for you, you might be really confused by the DSM-5 criteria. Truthfully, they are just not very easy to understand. So that's why today we are going to break down the criteria for autism as they are described in the DSM-5. Hi, my name is Megan, and welcome to Neurodivergent Magic, the YouTube channel for relatable and accessible neurodivergent content. Before we jump right into the DSM criteria, I do have a couple of disclaimers that I feel like are necessary for us to move forward. First, I just want to say that the DSM criteria, although they are what we use to diagnose autism, are insufficient to fully describe the autistic experience. See, the DSM-5 relies on what's called the deficit model, and autism is described entirely through its deficits, which is not fair because autism is not only defined by deficits. There are many things that are good about being autistic. Now, I say this, but take this with a grain of salt. See, I am not the type of person who believes that neurodivergence is a superpower, but I also don't believe it's all doom and gloom. I think neurodivergent brains work differently, and that's going to include lots of disadvantages, but also some advantages, and we should recognize those. So I just wanted to get that out of the way in case you listen to these criteria and you're thinking, wow, the word deficit is coming up a lot, and I'm starting to feel very inadequate. You're not. This is just the old school way of defining autism, and hopefully it's going to be changing soon. The DSM-5 text revised is coming out in March 2022, and people are very hopeful that it'll start moving away from the deficit model. All right, without further ado, let's get started with the very first criteria for autism as defined by the DSM-5. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. Okay, so this basically means that you have issues with social interaction, and it further defines what those issues look like as we move on, but this point is specifically about saying that these issues are consistent. They are consistent across multiple contexts, meaning that you see them at home, you see them at work, you see them at school, you see them all over. If you only see social deficits in one context, then it might not be autism. Something else could be going on. All right, to the next part. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. So reciprocity is the key word here. Neurotypical people expect a certain type of back and forth that autistic folks are not necessarily good at. Now, the DSM defines this as a deficit, whereas I would personally see it as a different form of communication. Neurotypical folks usually expect conversation to flow in a back and forth manner with relatively short snippets on each end, whereas a lot of autistic folks like to info dump, which is where we just tell you everything about what we're thinking about a certain thing, especially if it's a special interest. Neurotypical folks also tend to expect small talk, which is something that a lot of autistic folks are not super good at. You can see this in the last part, the failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. We don't always respond to small talk because we don't know what to say, and so we say nothing. And neurotypicals think that's a little odd. Okay, the next one is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormality in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communication. Basically, autistic folks have a completely different way of expressing themselves nonverbally. Eye contact doesn't feel super necessary for most autistic folks, or they might really enjoy lots of eye contact. Lots of autistic folks also enjoy stimming while they're talking to other people. And if you don't know, stimming is basically when you bounce your leg or flap your hands or play with your hair. Stimming is just a way of connecting with your body. All right, so the next one is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, to absence of interest in peers. So basically what this one means is that autistic folks tend to have trouble making friends with neurotypical people because we don't understand why they act so different in different social contexts. You're always yourself, so shouldn't you always act the same? Apparently in neurotypical society, that's not a thing. In different contexts, you act different ways. And because autistic folks kind of struggle with this, it can be really hard to maintain friendships with neurotypical folks. So the next one is restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. This basically means that autistic folks tend to have a very narrow range of interests and a very narrow range of tolerability. So what do I mean by that? Basically, autistic folks tend to find something they're passionate about, something they care about very deeply, and that becomes a major part of their personality, otherwise known as a special interest. And we use our special interests to communicate with others, to interact with others. And when other people aren't interested in those special interests, we can sometimes have a hard time connecting. Now, what I mean by a narrow range of tolerability is that autistic folks tend to be very prone to both over and under stimulation. So there's a very narrow window for what level of stimulation feels appropriate for us. This leads us to do things the same way over and over and over, aka the repetitive patterns of behavior. Next up is stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. Okay, so stereotyped or repetitive motor movements is almost always describing stimming, which, as I said, is basically just connecting with your body in some way. However, it also mentions repetitive use of speech, which is in reference to something called echolalia. Echolalia is when you hear a sound and you feel the deep desire to repeat that sound. It feels really good to just repeat that over and over and over and over. Okay, so next up is insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. So because the DSM-5 relies on the deficit model, you're not going to find anything positive in this section, but this is why so many autistic folks say that they have really good pattern recognition. Insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines. All of these rely on following a strict structure, and patterns have a strict structure. But it's not just about pattern recognition. Autistic folks do also tend to really enjoy routines. They tend to enjoy doing the same thing every day, and disruptions to that routine can feel incredibly distressing. Next up is highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. This is in reference to special interests, which I mentioned earlier, but also let's just talk about the wording of this for a second. Abnormal in intensity or focus. What makes it abnormal? Just because it's not neurotypical? It's such a fine line trying to define autism without defining it as purely a deficit. Obviously, like I said earlier, autism is not a superpower, okay? There are some major downsides to being autistic. But also, this idea that we are somehow less than because we're not neurotypical is completely false and should be completely done away with. Next up is hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. This basically means that you are either profoundly impacted by the environment around you, or you are able to completely tune it out without trying. And sometimes it can be a mixture of both, depending on the context. Next, symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies in later life. Now, this is a section I think the DSM-5 did really well on. If you're watching this, odds are you are either a late diagnosed autistic person or someone who's looking to get a late diagnosis. You might be asking yourself, I feel like I resonate with all of this autistic stuff. Why did no one catch it sooner? Or you may even be asking yourself, am I making it all up now? If it didn't exist when I was little, then it must not exist now. But here, the DSM reassures us that it is normal and okay for autistic traits to only make an appearance once social demands exceed our capacity. The American school system presents a lot of challenges to neurodivergent folks, but one way it could help mask autistic traits is the fact that it's very routine. You do the same thing every day in and out at school, and that could help mask some autistic traits. Okay, next up is symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So this is where we keep coming back to what I'm saying about autism not being a superpower. It's not just being quirky, it is a lifelong disability. You can absolutely learn to cope with your autism. You can find ways to make your life more autism friendly. You can learn different accommodations, but at the end of the day, you are impaired by this condition. Now, to be fair, the neurodiversity movement is sort of pushing for a movement away from this idea that it has to be a huge functional impairment all the time. The neurodiversity movement would say that autism is not inherently impairing, it's our environment that impairs us. I'm going to talk about this more in an upcoming video about the social model of disability, so keep an eye out for that. Finally, last but not least, these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability or global developmental delay. This is just basically to say that some of these symptoms and traits can be caused by intellectual disability, and it's important to differentiate between what is causing these symptoms or traits. Is it autism? Is it an intellectual disability or global developmental delay? It's important to understand where these traits are coming from. I hope this plain English explanation of the DSM criteria for autism makes everything much more clear to you. Hopefully now you have a much more comprehensive view of what autism really is. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next Tuesday.